welcome to the Big Van Book Club. My name is Rory, and I'm here with Avalon Bourne, and we are going to be discussing the... You look concerned, Avalon. Are we all right?
No, I'm good.
Okay. For a minute, I was like, what's happening? Is it all pixelated or something? No, we're going to be finishing our discussion of The Broken Places by Frances Peck, a book we've been reading for our first series of the Big Van Book Club for the last 5 episodes, I think it was. Avalon, how are you today?
I'm pretty good. Looking forward to talking about the final portions of this book, and more importantly, our final thoughts, and whether or not we actually enjoyed the book.
And our next book.
Yes.
So I do want to frame something up ahead of time that I realized I'd never made particularly clear to the general audience, but this like Wednesday night thing, Big Van Book Club, Book Van Big Club, is a as we have books to discuss thing. As much as I would love to know enough people and have enough like solid Vancouver writers that I feel like I could really run it every week for the whole time, I don't think I can, but I happened to choose to start this when I knew there was 2 books going on, and we will discuss near the end what next week's, or not next week, the weeks after. So there's a reason why next week is a week off. We'll talk about that when we get there. But we will announce what the book is. So not only are we here for discussing the ending and deciding what we think of it and letting her know our final thoughts, we're also going to announce our second series, which will be a shorter series. It's a shorter book. And yeah, so there's lots of good reasons to hang around if you've hung around this far, honestly. And if you're, I guess I should say this up front, if you are completely new to this and you were like, I clicked on this link just cause, this is a book club that you can attend in your underwear. And that was my way of trying to capture the fact that anybody online can come and join in this discussion. There's a live chat going right now. You do need to have a YouTube account. It's not up to me to be able to use the live chat, but as long as you have your YouTube account, you can click the little live chat button. Depending on what you're on, it'll pop up, and you can offer your thoughts on Broken Places if you've been reading along. All right. So I'm not going to waste any time because I know that everybody just wants to get to the larger discussion here. I will say hello, GS, and hello, Just Fleece It Out, regular members of the Big Van Book Club, and this mysterious new member there, the real Avalon Bourne. But what we discussed this week was part 5. What we read this week, and are going to discuss is part 5 of The Broken Places. And I'll just give a brief summary of the end. To be honest, there's 2 chapters in it, but we usually go through chapter by chapter in case somebody didn't get all the way through, so they have a chance to jump out before we get to their spoilers. But if you read the first chapter of this and not the last 5 pages of the book, I don't understand you. So you're on your own. It's all spoilers all the time. But I do want to make sure that we get to just a few of the last threads that get tied up in these last few pages before we go to our overarching thoughts. So in part 5, we are basically left with 3 people. There are 3 people left alive, 2 of which have anything to do with part 5, and 1 is kind of implied. So that's Kiki, or Kyle, who was the partner of, I was going to say Jeff. Joe, the partner of Joe, who we discover in the end of the last section is blown up by the worst person in the world, Tane, and burns, Tane gets himself killed, kills Joe, sort of doesn't seem to kill necessarily Anna and Dodie. Dodie kills those 2 with the same fire. It's complicated. You should have read the book at this point. But that means that we are left with Kiki, who sort of had a tense conversation with Joe before having to hike all the way up a road that we don't see this part of it on a broken leg, but obviously he made it because he is going to see the show of Summer Rain, who is the young Stedman girl that we've been following throughout. So, spoiler to what we knew pretty much from the first section. Summer Rain is a nickname of the artist that why can I not think of her name? I'm bad with names tonight.
Sydney.
Sorry?
Name's Sydney.
Sydney Stedman was trying to it's what Sydney Stedman became. We sort of, and we get a little bit of closure on, well, closure is a hard word to wrap here, but a little bit of closure on Anne, who was the Ukrainian help assistant to Miss Doty. And we get a little bit of closure on Sydney, who seems to have seen Charlotte in Chicago, and that's sort of where the book ends. So basically a few things happen, really brief. There's a bunch about Kiki having many years of just not being able to sort of be in relationships with people because he misses Joe and the love they had. And then eventually kind of getting past that a bit. In the course of that discussion, in that chapter, we also discover that Kiki, by sort of freak coincidence, manages to get Sydney burns as a part of his plastic surgery project. He realizes that this is who Joe was with, and she tells him the story of Joe saving her life, but does not let on that Joe is his partner. And he's going to a show because she always sends him tickets because he helped with her plastic surgery, because he's doing productive plastic surgery now. I guess like socially, there's a few points in the book where he talks about this. And he's going to go and tell Sydney that Joe was his partner and give her back this necklace that I guess Joe had given her, that he stole from her while he was doing surgery, which I get, but also it's a bit weird. The and then it sort of, like I said, it sort of wraps with Sydney internal monologue about her life. I don't think there's much there that I didn't know already, but there is this moment of discussing that she sits around sort of in disguise when she goes to various cities as an artist, because nobody ever knows what happened to Charlotte. They just find her truck in whatever. And she claims sometimes to have maybe seen her, and the most recent one seemed the most certain, though she still wasn't certain, which was in Chicago, given that that is where Charlotte often talked about going to restart her life. It seems likely that the book is trying to tell us that she did briefly see her mother, and her mother just fully abandoned her. So that is the end of the book. I guess no holds barred. What do you want to talk about, Avalon?
Yeah, so it's sort of obviously, like last week, that was like the big climatic section, with the fire and everyone dying pretty much. So like this sort of final section is the wrapping up of the last few ties, and then we get a jump into the future. I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't get any more Charlotte, but I do think that where we left her was probably a good spot for her and her character, and it kind of makes sense that we don't really know what happened to her. I did find it interesting, though, that Sydney seems to have a lot more forgiveness for her father than she does for her mother, and maybe that's because her father is dead and her mother has abandoned her. Fair enough, but I think there was a line in there where she is sort of thinking over things, and says that, you know, her dad did the best he could, which, did he really?
I feel like this is often what children of like various forms of abuse say, and I usually
Yeah.
just go, yeah, I bet they did.
Like, ooh. And then sort of in the same breath, seems to sort of, you know, view her mother with a much sharper lens. Yeah, so I mean that you know, that's kind of interesting. And I also find it interesting that we're supposed to be, you know, like 10 years in the future or so, right? So Sydney's like 26, 27. And like she still seems like kind of a brat. You know, so I did appreciate, and I that's not a criticism, because I actually enjoyed that. Like I thought, yeah, like I didn't really want an ending where it's like, oh yeah, no, like all the things, all the trauma, everything I've suffered, and now I'm so, you know, I'm forgiving and blah blah blah. No, like I think she should be a little bit sharp and sour, and
I think there's only so good you can be with parents like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think on the whole, I enjoyed the ending. I thought, you know, it was sort of some nice. It was nice to sort of have like the stories of Kyle and Sydney kind of intersect, like in the way that they did, and you know, this sort of rebirth through her art, I think felt very true to form as well. So I think it was a good ending for the story.
I think I wanted a bit more from it, but what was done I don't really have any problem with. Like I you know, I had the same thought that GS says. I expected more Charlotte. I expected more Charlotte as well. But to your point, this was exactly what I thought, which was, why? Like, what else is there to know about her? And whatever final thought she had, you know, when she thought her daughter was alive, well, we already know what she's going to do when her daughter's dead. Like, which is what she would have thought at that time. So, like, and I think also to some extent the narrative is saying, like, she had a choice. She made it repeatedly. So she's not really worth our time anymore. You know, whoever she wants to be, she will be, but it's not a good person. So I felt like that was a solid conclusion. I do like using that method to show that Sydney still yearns a bit for the love that she never got from her mother. I think she's harsher on her mother too, and I feel like that's intentional in the book. I do think I have in the back of my head, like, I don't know how much other writers do this, but I had in the back of my head, usually you do have a kind of metafiction in your head of who's telling this story. And I did wonder if this was meant to, on a very subtle level, be Sydney telling the story based on information she could collect later, in which case she wouldn't know anything about what happened to her mother, and would likely have thought, like, what do I think my selfish mother would have done? So I did kind of have that idea in my head for a long time, and like, if her mother truly was that way, I don't know if that's the case, but the only thing that I really was unhappy about, but I don't think was the terrible thing, I just was kind of unhappy about it, and I don't understand why, is why didn't I get to see the scene of Kiki talking to Sydney? Like, I felt like that was a really good scene to give me some catharsis, some love in this book of miserable and upset people doing terrible things to each other. Like, it reminds me of a note I got when I was like, I don't know, 18 or something, and I was at a film camp. We made a film. You make a film in a week. And I remember there was a scene in it. It was a weird art film, a weird art kid. I don't know. People know this at this point. But there's a scene in it where, like, this figure in it of fear, the protagonist, gives it a hug, and that sort of ends this otherwise kind of horror film. And the note I got was, can we linger longer on that shot? And because it's a good moment to have for the audience. And so like we did slow motion, it's kind of jumpy and whatever else, but I always remembered that note. It's one of those weird things. It was a specific note, but I feel like it was a larger dramatic point, which is, you know, your audience kind of struggles through some pain with you and wants these moments of catharsis. I want some kind of hope in the world. Like, very few books don't give that. And I felt like it had such a good making of catharsis. 10 years later, Joe was my partner. I'm sorry. All of this kind of stuff. And it was like, no. And I don't understand why it wasn't there. I get why Charlotte wasn't there. I get why a whole bunch of those 10 years weren't there. I get all of that, but I don't get why I didn't get that scene. Other than that,
yeah,
I was happy with everything that was there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. And, you know, like one of the things that I did find a little bit that I struggled with, you know, with this book is that, you know, like there isn't a lot of dialogue in this book. And you know, like dialogue is really how the action sequence, right? Like it's how we get things moving along, and it's how we get to know characters and how they interact with the world and how they respond to things. But you know, I have been thinking about this, you know, over the last, you know, week or so, ever since, you know, I finished the book. And you know, and one thing sort of struck me, you know, that we have all of these different characters and these different points of view, but we have so little dialogue, and so the only way that we really sort of have any understanding of these characters is through their own you know, inner monologues that we spend a lot of time in. So we get their perception of themselves, and then we get you know, this very sort of shallow, superficial perspective from the way that other people see them. And the more that I have thought about that, the more that I thought that you know, it's probably deliberate, that, you know, like we don't really get a well-rounded view of these characters, because I think they're all, you know, meant to represent something, and it's, you know, I think, yeah, the story is trying to, you know, give more of it's trying to be a bit of an allegory, and so we're getting, you know, rather flat characters. And so when I kind of thought about it that way, I was more okay with the ending and not really seeing those scenes, because I don't know if that would have held true with the type of story that had been written. So I can understand it from, you know, an artistic choice point of view. I think it is still something that I definitely struggled with while reading. And then, yeah, we sort of, you know, wrap up 10 years with some pretty emotionally charged moments within those 10 years. And then we don't really kind of get to see how that plays out, but then we don't really get to see how a lot of things play out in the novel. So I think I've kind of come to terms with that when sort of thinking about what the author was trying to do as a whole.
Yeah, I do want to address something that I thought was an interesting observation here from Just Fleece It Out and in partner with GS here. Just Fleece It Out says, I too was hoping for more Charlotte, but it makes sense with her disappearing. And then GS says, yes, we feel abandoned too, lol. But I think that's probably a good point. I think that might be the point, that as much as Charlotte has abandoned Sydney, she abandons us, and so we don't get to know any more than Sydney did. Or less even. The GS says, I missed the part where Kiki decided to return the medallion. It's in the end of chapter 19. I think he mentions it. But he's going to the art show, and he's going to tell her that Joe. That was my understanding at the end. Maybe I completely misunderstood.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, I mean, I agree with GS. I did a double take on Kiki taking Joe's medallion from the sleeping patient. Yeah, I mean, I get, like, again, like, I can understand from a, narrative or artistic point of view, like, why that choice was made. But yeah, like, imagine waking up from such a traumatic experience and, a possession, like probably one of your only possessions at this point that has, great significance for you is just gone because your doctor took it.
Yeah. I mean, it's sweet, but also what the hell. But to address your point more so, I do find, as a person who is an artist and is a writer and understands how we get into our own projects and our own themes and our own symbolism, that it's hard for me to ignore that there are some obvious intentions between what's left out and what's in, and the things that we rub against, that we've sort of talked about our sort of gut reactions to over the weeks, probably are, given how ably written this book is, probably are not that unintentional and aren't really, flaws or whatever else. But that makes it hard for me to sort of assess, right? Because that the way that I try to assess things is I try to understand, what do I believe is the work's goal? And then based on what I think the work's goal is, I sort of judge the techniques that are used as to how I responded to them, whether they led me to that end point. And I will say it's not crystal clear to me what the goal of the book was. Not to say I don't have any idea of what it is, just crystal clear. Like, if I was to put in a straight sentence, I'm not sure what I would say for that. But I will say a couple of things stand out. And after thinking about this week, the first thing is, why so much internal monologues and why no discussion? And I do think that a lot is being done with the imagery of tectonic plates there. I've mentioned this before. I think there's the idea that we live these little lives where we mainly only know other things by rubbing up against them. We only sort of find other people, or they only come into our attention through conflict, or irritation, or whatever else. And so there was this idea, I think, I don't know how intentional it is, but there is this idea that each of these people is their own tectonic plate, and they are rubbing up against each other, creating these ruptures and earthquakes that destroy the things around them and other people. And so I do think that is an intentional thing. So on the one hand, the fact that, if that is the intention, the fact that it drew me to that conclusion, obviously there was success in it. I do think about what is lost, though, as well. An earthquake is remembered as much for its, a lot of hay is made in the book about sort of the tension that sits there for a long time and then suddenly releases. But there's also just the endless sort of destruction and rippling and whatever else that comes in. And I do feel like there's points in the book where there could have been more of that. And so, like, thinking of that goal, I feel like there's a lot made of the tension between things. Maybe not as much of the rubbing between things, because there are things in the story that almost never come into conflict. And it makes it feel odder that they're there. And I guess I'll stop talking in a minute, but what I'm trying to wrap my point as a point here is, I feel like my final assessment here is that The Broken Place has two cool ideas that I'm not sure how well they play with each other. The first is the idea of this sort of Gen X mumblecore, internal monologue heavy, the isolation of your own thoughts, feelings, fears, anxieties, and how that comes out in enigmatic ways to the people around you who don't really know why you are the way you are. They just know that you are. And to do that, the text does this really intricate internal monologues. It goes for, boldly sometimes for pages on one character's internal monologue, which I think works. However, when you're going to so finely paint every line and crease in the face of one character and then put them in a painting with that many other characters, what I felt started to happen was a sense of stagnation. There were definitely points where I was like, it doesn't feel like we're moving, and that's not always the best thing in a story. And the second thing that it does, though, is it starts to make it harder to ascertain what all of these details are doing to build to a larger point, right? Like if for some reason I'm thinking of this as a painting. In a painting, you choose the details that draw the eye to certain areas, and then, you leave out details that distract. But if you draw every detail of everything in the shot, it can become, I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be looking. And there were definitely moments where I felt like the weight of the first project, the intricate internal monologues, was at times starting to weigh down the overall theme and point of the book, in that I couldn't quite pluck it out of that many details. I would say that is sort of my overarching view of what I think the project is and where I think it sort of ran up against some stuff. That said, I will say, on the whole, I think the book worked really well for something so complicated, and I did enjoy all the characters except for one particular one that we've already discussed last week. But I actually did. I did like all the character arcs. I remember who they are. I remembered names. I never remember names. So that's sort of the briefest I can do of what did Rory see overall.
I mean, I think that's like a really insightful kind of overview of the competing kind of narrative structures I think were happening with this book. And I think when it comes to literature, or like really any kind of art, whether it's a book or a TV show or a movie or art piece or whatever it is, I always ask myself, was I entertained? Because I do think that a huge, really the main purpose of art is to entertain us, and through that entertaining, maybe we learn something more, or maybe we figure out something else about ourselves or someone else or the world at large. But it's done in a way that isn't pedantic or heavy-handed or scholarly or any of that. It's done in a way that is moving and meaningful and inspirational but ultimately entertaining. And I think sometimes that word can take on perhaps some negative connotations because people want their art to be taken seriously, but I don't think that to entertain doesn't mean that it can't be serious. And so I think that's sort of the bar that I have for myself. And with this book, I was definitely entertained. I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed learning about this world, reading about this world and these characters and all of that. I mean, there's things that didn't quite work for me as perhaps they were intended, and aspects of it that I found a bit frustrating. But I think as a whole, I definitely enjoyed reading it. And I think sort of the theme that, as I've had some time to kind of think about, really stands out for me is this this theme and this sort of push and pull between metamorphosis and metanoia, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, but these are both processes of change, right? So metamorphosis is probably the one that we're more familiar with, which is a physical change. It's quite literally what happens to a larvae as it moves along its insect life into whatever kind of final form it takes. But it's taken on a lot of literal meanings, and so I think we have quite a few physical changes that happen. To Sydney in particular, like with the scars and like the tattoos that she's done, and sort of this physical transformation that she's undergone through being so severely injured in the fire and then kind of emerging as this artist. But I think that's also true for Vancouver, right? Going through this earthquake and the landscape changing and all these physical changes that are wrought because of this natural disaster, versus the internal change. And metanoia is really literally means a change that's wrought through penitence or a spiritual conversion. But it's used, I think, more colloquially as just as an internal change, like internal process of change. Changing your mind to a point that fundamentally changes who you are. And so I think we sort of see, we see some evidence of that as well, about the way that both Kyle and Sydney, the way that they view themselves and others, from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. So I think Kyle's arc is probably the most obvious in terms of going through a spiritual change through penitence, since he basically spends the whole book on a mountain begging for forgiveness for everything he's done. So I think that's a more literal interpretation of it. But I think you see it through Sydney as well, and then again through the earthquake as the larger metaphor, creating these internal changes that we don't see on the outside. So I think kind of looking at the book in that lens, I think that was done really, really well, and kind of using the earthquake as this sort of larger metaphor to examine these characters and their choices and the lives that they were living, and for those who survived, the lives they were living before and after.
Yeah, I think you did a good job there about the alignment of physical changes and this idea of internal psychological changes. This word, I do find it funny that you said, like, colloquially metanoia is used a certain. I don't think colloquially that word is used personally. Like, this is the first time everyone who's read this book has ever heard of it.
You don't use it in casual conversation?
I will now. Just consistently, inconsistently, though. Like, it'll be like, that recycling, it's going through a metanoia. What? Look it up later. Don't worry about it.
It's like, oh yeah, Mike's busy this weekend. He's going through a lot of metanoia.
Oh, I heard you can get that if you eat too much meat. Yeah. GS says that was very brief, Rory. Good job. I assume that's sarcasm. The I am curious, by the way, what chat's final thoughts are now that we've sort of finished the book. I desperately want to know, like, where other people are at. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, like, the things that the book does well are many, and like, it is a technically proficient book in many ways. At no point, like, I can't think of the only thing that, like, is the point I've already made, which is I feel like there is a cost to the will to spell out every character in so much detail, is a sense of pace and an overall sense of vision of what was the focus of all of these things. Especially, by the way, emphasized by the fact that they didn't have dialogue with each other meant that it wasn't as clear to me where these themes and internal stories intersected with each other. There was less opportunities to grab that point. But beyond that, that's like the only kind of technical thing I have. I have absolutely no criticisms of any of the writing because it's fucking fabulous. Like, it's even some of the, like, best writing, like, won awards writing that I've read, usually has some sentence somewhere that sticks in my jaw. Like, I'm like, that's a bad line, man. Why is that in there? Or, you know, every writer has their own quirks on prose, where like a sentence goes a bit too long and you can feel it in the rhythm and you're like, why is there so many adjectives for this, or whatever. Like, I'm sure no normal human being does this, but I'm sure I'm not alone on this, Avalon. I'm sure you have this feeling.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, it's like you're being abruptly brought out of the inner world that you're in while reading, because like someone uses a stupid word, or like their sentence is clumsy, and it's aggravating.
Which, by the way, and I feel more justified to say it now, was why I never finished Goblet of Fire many years ago.
Oh.
I got through when She Who Shall Not Be Named started believing her own hype, which I think what came about Goblet of Fire. Her sentence structure sucks. She is so bad at like pace and prose and rhythm that I just was like, I cannot do another 300 pages of this. I got like halfway through, but I have no moments like that in this really pretty large book. Like it's not like huge. It's not like Dune or something like this, but it is like 400 pages or so. That's not a small book. You would expect to find missteps in it, you know, for how much intricacy is going on. And on a prose level, I never had a problem with it. On a character level, I never really had a problem with it. I had, you know, the criticisms I made, for example, about Anna were really about like, how necessary is this for the plot? You know, is this really the best way to endear me as an audience and whatever else? But I never felt like it was inconsistently presented. I didn't feel like she was doing stuff that I didn't understand based on her backstory. Like, the characters were responsive to the events in their life. The events in their life made sense with the character I was presented. They were distinct from each other. They had their own voices, their own turns of phrases, their own ways of dealing with things. And there's a lot of them on the page. Like, it's a very intricately woven and beautifully done book in that sense, and in no small way, that is sort of the enjoyable tapestry of the Broken Places. It is indeed, to me, an intricate tapestry.
Yeah, I would agree I would agree with what you said as well. I think the characters were all, you know, distinct and built out. Just Fleece It Out says, it did seem almost frustrating to have so much character development where we end up invested in everyone only to have them all die in an explosion. Although to wrap up that many character stories would have taken forever. I mean, I think when it comes to the characters, I do wonder at what purpose Ms. Doty and Anna actually serve the plot.
I think that point is emphasized in this last part too.
Yeah, like we don't like, there's really no mention of them in the last, you know,
the only mention
whatever it
is that they couldn't
pages.
identify her.
Yeah.
Which is horrible.
And so they only really seem to be there to compound the tragedy of the explosion. They didn't really serve any kind of key purpose to the plot. I mean, I guess, you know, they having them in the house, you know, sort of made Joe think, oh, okay, I've got a responsibility here. But I think that was already kind of covered with Sydney. I think, you know, they'd already established the bond between them and that he felt, you know, some responsibility to her. So I just, and sort of thinking again about, you know, the book as a whole, I mean, Miss Doty in particular, like, we don't really get much of her perspective at all. So it's not like she's sort of contributing to, you know, the narrative at all. And, you know, with Anna, it's just, like trauma after trauma and awful thing after awful thing. and she just dies. And so I think that was kind of the big sort of glaring part of the book that didn't work for me. I didn't find those characters necessary, and I think that if they had been, yeah, I mean, and so much time, was also dedicated to Anna too, but also on, everything horrible that had happened to her. And it just, I have a tough time with a character whose sole purpose is to kind of be, this source of misery. And then there's and it doesn't serve anything in the book.
Yeah. I did this week find myself thinking, as I track through my thoughts, they could have been taken out. I'm not sure the book would have been worse for it. Like, I'm not sure. I mean, my most charitable guess, especially in the end there, just Fleece It Out says, although Anna being unidentifiable played right into her being an illegal immigrant, escaping jail time in her own home country. I mean, it does, but like even Sydney never really remembers her, or doesn't bring her up that much. Like, I mean, the most charitable I have is that it's a commentary on the intersectional side of feminism. That, does intersectional feminism care about the old and the foreign, or is it just for white ladies? Which is, a fair critique, but I do wonder. I think GS said it best a couple of weeks ago, where they said Anna's kind of her own book. It's not that it was necessarily a bad story; it's that maybe it just didn't fit here. I mean, it sort of felt like I went and had dinner at someone's house once. They're kind of like show-offy people. It's okay. I'm not going to see them again. I don't like them. But they served lobster and lamb chops. I like both those things, but you want to know something? They don't go together, really at all.
Oh, and they don't.
I think they were basically just served because they're two expensive things they could show off, right? No, I don't think that's what's happening in the book. I don't think it's a matter of showing off, but I do feel like, the more I thought about it, the more I was like, it's not that I disliked Anna. It's not that I even felt like she was unrealistically presented. It's not even that I particularly disliked Miss Doty. I thought there was a lot of compelling elements there. It's that I don't know where they fit in the story, other than just sort of make some points about the main characters. And given that they are representing a part of society that's already been kind of put upon unfairly, it didn't feel good.
And I think with Miss Doty in particular, and this isn't really, the book's fault, but I would also just really, I think I would like to see a character like that, utilized in a way where she actually has some purpose and maybe a bit of dignity. I think I think there's most of the time when we have characters, particularly female characters who are older, they're often portrayed as a burden, or then they die and like their death sort of becomes something, or they don't really get to be kind of a character in their own right, and they often don't get to do it with any real autonomy. And so it felt like a little bit of a missed opportunity to have this story when you have all of these different points of view, and you're giving one of those points of view to an older woman, and then really her whole story arc is about her diaper, and it's
I mean, that might be a little bit reductive, but I see her point.
I'm being a little bit
the ring
facetious.
I think is probably more
the ring too. But I think like there could have been like a little bit of a missed opportunity to give her, some agency, and doing that I don't think would have negated the necessity of her having, this nurse, right? Like she could, still require care, but it felt a little bit, what were we getting from Ms. Doty? It's
I don't know.
Not much, right? And yeah, I think that was yeah, a little bit disappointing when sort of thinking about what that character could have been.
GS says the most realistic thing here, which is, but I mean, this is really common in books because we're all artists and we like, that's our own fantasy. GS says, I doubted that Sydney's one-man show would be that big of a hit. It almost certainly wouldn't be. But, you know, we're all artists and we want to believe that one day the world will care.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded awful to me.
I have seen some performance art, and my opinion is that performance art really only works when it's really bizarre. Like, if it needs to really own odd, uncomfortable moments. Anything that tries to be more sincere than that usually falls apart. But yeah, I do want to sort of circle back to Just Fleece It Out, saying like having them all die in an explosion is kind of unsatisfying. And I guess I can kind of feel Frances's tension there, because one of the points of an earthquake versus any other kind of natural disaster is that the only thing you can do for it is prepare for it, but you never know when it's coming. It's kind of arbitrary. It's not justice. It's not a response from a vengeful god. It's just a random thing that happens that no one controls. And so I do feel like from a symbolic side, it makes sense that in the middle of people's lives, something horrible and somewhat undeserved happens to a lot of people. And I do feel like overall there is this element of the book that is things don't work out because you want them to. And so I think the ending does a lot, and that the loss of like character resolution and stuff does a lot about, is saying a lot about something. But at the same time, I'm sure Frances has done enough book work, you know, as an editor and as a ghostwriter and all these sorts of things, to know that there's a gamble in that, which is, you know, I've had stories where I've done stuff like that, and the people don't necessarily like it. Even if they get it, they might be like, yeah, but still, I want to know, right? And so, like, it's tricky because, you know, maybe if we had another 50, 75 pages of resolution, we'd be like, well, I don't know, it just kind of fizzles out in the end. Like, you know, maybe it wouldn't have worked out. Because, like, what exactly were the arcs left? Like, Tane wasn't going to correct. I don't understand the point of Anna's arc anyways, so I won't say anything more about that. But same with Dodie. But Joe was not a particularly round character to begin with. Actually, let me clarify that language for a moment for everybody. In writing, there's round and flat characters. It's more of a thing in script writing than it is in books, but it is a concept that crosses all stories, and that is your round characters are like the ones that really fill the page and you know the most about. They have a character arc, they start somewhere and they end somewhere. But you can't have every character in the book be that, or in a story, because it gets too busy and nobody knows what's going on anymore, which was sort of a part of my critique of it. You have flat characters, which are sometimes called supporting characters, and flat characters have character traits. They even may have their own conflicts, but they don't really change over the course of the book. They sort of exist to support round characters in their arc. I would argue that Joe is a flat character. I felt that from the beginning. Joe is a support character who's there to make a counterpoint to round characters in Tane and Sydney. And to some extent Kiki, but, you know, Kiki, I don't know, they barely interact, so who knows. And I do think that Dodie is an example of a flat character who's there to support a larger point or serve as a counterpoint to other character arcs. Which makes... It was just part of why I say that Anna is kind of confusing to me, because Anna presents a lot of the features of being a rounded character, but has no arc that I could recognize. Well, I guess, I mean, sort of a downward turn, but, like, I'm not sure what the overall point was. And I don't want to keep retreading that, but just in this, I wasn't too sure, because then in that last scene, she seems to be playing as a flat character for Joe, which was weird to me. So anyways, I just wanted to clarify to people, because sometimes I realize sometimes I drop things that I think are literary theory that I just forget that not everyone knows. But anyways, when I say round or flat characters, that's what I mean. Yeah, I think I've made my point in that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I've been pretty, I think, honest about or open about how I view Joe from the get-go, and I think I think that, you know, Joe is really there to provide this motivation for Kiki. You know, first at the beginning where he wants out of the relationship, and then, you know, once he's sort of stranded on the mountain as a reason to continue and, you know, push himself past, you know, the pain and exhaustion that he's in to get back, because he's getting back for Joe. And then after Joe dies, then it's also you know, this impetus for Kiki to, you know, sort of live a certain kind of life and behave a certain sort of way in his future relationship. So, you know, I think Joe sort of makes sense to the plot of the book, because he does serve as that impetus for Kiki and also for Sydney. But, you know, in terms of a character, yeah, I mean, there's not much there. And also, the other thing that I found a little incongruous too, you know, where Sydney's talking, or Summer Rain is talking about, you know, Joe at the very end, and like, he wasn't that great. I mean, you know, like, yes, he was very capable, and you know, was the only one who sort of knew what needed to be done in an emergency, but his interactions with Sydney, like, weren't exactly filled with kindness or warmth or anything like that. It was just, compared to her parents, he seemed, you know, a little bit more competent and paid a bit more attention.
I think that's enough, though, right? Like,
yeah,
if you have a life with no love and you get a little bit of it, I think that's probably enough. I don't know.
I think it could have been a bit more. I think Joe just didn't really exhibit an awful lot of kindness for someone who we're told had such an impact on these people's lives.
I laugh because every time the way you, like, tow yourself into that water each week, I just want to say, what if Joe sucks? Like, I don't want to say he sucks. I'm just saying I personally would shove him into traffic.
I think he's the worst.
I like Joe, by the way. I like Joe. But I think I'm kind of... He could have been nicer for the kind of character role he was serving. Like, I felt like it was realistic for him to be kind of a moody and not really that nice and whatever else. I felt like that was realistic, but I was like, I don't know if realism is always the best move here, because, like, you know, again, I felt like he was a support character. He was there to sort of inspire people to be better, as you point out. And, you know, he does these things that sort of inspire it. I did have a bit of a... I guess one thing I didn't mention was, like, Kiki's conclusion. I'm happy about it, but also I don't necessarily understand it, because Kiki's dysfunction is presented as, like, a dysfunction, like a kind of trauma that is manifested through sexual exhibitionism and so on, that he has a problem, basically, and he's gotten himself to a point where he can't even enjoy the things he does love. And so there is this arc of him going through great punishment and coming to the conclusion that under, you know, the suffering of life, what matters most to you is love. And so it gets him down the mountain, and I'm okay with all of that. But then in the description of, like, the 10 years that follows, well, they had a very sort of psychological and mechanical discussion of how he got the way he did. There wasn't really an equal one about how he got out of it. There was sort of, like, times past, he was sad about Joe, but, like, and maybe this is the psychology degree in me, but realizing that you love your partner and miss them is not enough to really do away with that level of like sexual addiction. And yeah, there is a reference that he had it made it worse for a while and whatever else, but I was like, I kind of wanted a bit more about like the little chores of life, like the thing that, and I'll admit this is just my own bugaboo in stories. Something that bothers me in stories is when they present a real world problem and then they solve it through metaphorical, story stuff that writers like us love. So it'll be like, here's a real world problem. Dude has clinical depression. But he finds love. Now he's not depressed. And like, I'm like, you can love people and still have depression, so that doesn't feel satisfying to me. So like, I guess I wanted to, even just a couple of lines about like, he had to, maybe there were, and I forgot them, but he had to like struggle through therapy or whatever, because he talks about his broken relationships and stuff after Joe, but it seems to be framed as like he misses Joe. I don't know. I guess I wanted a bit more from that, given that like Kiki is the most substantial resolution we get. He's the one who has the most growth and change. So I was like, can we invest another 4 or 5 pages on Kiki? I would have liked that.
Yeah, and I think, as you've been talking about that, and also I think, the comments that we've had in chat about, Kiki and Sydney being connected, but we don't actually get to share in that connection. Like Kiki's sort of the one character who doesn't really have any interactions with anyone, really. I mean, aside from Joe at the very beginning of the novel, and then it's just him on that mountain, and then we get, this monologue, internal monologue from him at the end, where there was obviously some interaction with Sydney, but none that we see, and so it makes it a little bit challenging to get, a real sense of who Kiki is when we're not in his head.
Yeah.
Because he's quite unkind to himself and quite harsh to himself.
True.
And so the Kiki that we're exposed to, or that we have access to, is the one that he's telling us about. Like, we don't actually sort of see how he is around other people, other than, Joe at the very beginning. And so I think we're kind of left with this, sort of skewed, kind of, inflated version of him that's really fixated on all the things that he dislikes about himself. We don't really see anything beyond that. So I think, the ending's kind of unsatisfying because we haven't really had a chance to see Kiki in action, so to speak.
Yeah. I think you put that well. I given that Kiki is not the one I would have guessed would have the meat of the ending, I would have expected a bit more. Exactly the kind of stuff you're talking about, and you make a good point, though I don't think I would have articulated it that way before. It is the better way to put it, which is just we don't get the perspective of who Kiki is, other than who Kiki is after seriously imploding their relationship and not talking to Joe. But obviously that's not a traditional Kiki moment. So I'm not sure how informative that actually is. I would have liked to have more of that, I guess. I do agree that he ends up being one of the ones that is the most. I think about maybe halfway through the book I realized that Kiki was the main character arc. If Sydney is sort of the main character, he's sort of the main character arc. I did recognize that was coming. I don't think I predicted that everyone was going to die in an explosion, but I don't know that I was that surprised by it. But yeah, I think I would have liked a bit more meat on the Kiki bone.
Yep.
There's so many better ways I could have said this. And I didn't say them any of those ways. I said meat on the kiki bone. So, yeah, I mean, I think overall, it's a really solid book. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that as much as there are a lot of previous things that the author, Frances Peck, has worked on, this is her first book. And there is something to be said about, like, you know, when you first put it out there, your first work, there's a lot that happens that you're figuring out and so on. And I think this is an abnormally strong first book. If I didn't know otherwise, I would not have guessed it was somebody's first book. And I think that there is a level of maturity in the writing that I take for granted at times. I do point out that, like, the problem with good writing is exactly good because you don't notice it. Like, you know, if you're stopping and going, ooh, that's pretty prose, like, generally speaking, that's not actually a particularly good thing to have happen in a book. You know, now and then, sure, but good writing is mostly invisible to a reader, and that it feels smooth, like it's your own thoughts. And so the fact that, like, so much of this book doesn't have those moments of, like, showboating on prose and stuff is a good thing. It has its moments usually in the beginning of the chapters where it did its more poetic stuff, but it was very restrained and focused in ways that I fail to be in my writing, on its characters and their contributions to the plot. And I guess, yeah, for me it was Lamb and Lobster. It was, you know, two really strong concepts. I'm not sure they always played well together. And there were elements of the book that I felt like could have been peeled off and done better justice elsewhere. But the parts of the book that worked. And we talked a few times about something, and I thought about it this week, which was the idea of, like, a more exciting earthquake, like going through the city more. And I guess I still do want something like that. But I also thought about it as there is something singular and unique in the vision of an earthquake book set in a single house and character focused. It certainly didn't do what I expected at most turns. And I think there's something to be said about having a unique vision about a topic that is covered by other books. I mean, disaster books are a genre. We can go and find, I mean, hell, I remember as a kid, I loved that terrible Sylvester Stallone movie, Daylight, where there's an earthquake and they get trapped in a tunnel and they have to get out of this, like, tunnel, like, together. You know, like, I go in for that kind of action, but it didn't want to be that book. And it had a different way of looking at an earthquake. And it was a consistent and thematic way of looking at it. And it didn't shy away from a lot of its goals, which were lofty and complex. And on the whole, when I read a chapter, I was compelled to read another one, which is, you know, not every book. I don't know. I'm not going to name names, but I'm just going to say there's a lot of books I just put down and I don't finish, and because they're bad. I mean, there's a lot of modern books. If you're a person out there who doesn't read a lot, and you're like, I've tried to read a couple of books, they're so boring. My friend said they were great and they're boring. Just know that you are correct. They are. A lot of them are very bad.
Or perhaps you don't enjoy them.
Yes, of course, all art is subjective. I do assign to the idea that there's no hierarchy of art, but like,
aside from Dan Brown, who's just the worst.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, most of my criticisms of Dan Brown are personal for him as a person. He could write a great book, and I'd still hate it for who it was that wrote it. You watch. If I ever get famous, someone's going to drag this up, and they're going to be like, did you not say that you actually personally hate Dan Brown? And I'll have no choice but to just double down. I'll be like, yes, absolutely.
It'll be one of the greatest literary feuds of all time.
Dan Brown doesn't care that I exist. Dan Brown doesn't care that anybody
So
exists.
if you got famous.
Let's just say I'm not losing sleep. Yeah. Well, is there any, what is sort of your closing assessment? I know we kind of did our closing comments, but if you were to, after all that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, I definitely, right, I definitely enjoyed reading this book. I thought that there was, some interesting themes that were played with. And, one thing that I don't think I have mentioned, and we've talked a lot about, characters and our own personal views of the different characters. But I think that, when I've been talking about all of these characters, liking or disliking or impressions, a lot of that isn't, it's not sort of criticism. It's more like, I really enjoy when books lean into unlikable characters, particularly unlikable narrators, protagonists, all of that, because I think, then it's very refreshing. And plus, we also sort of get to see people who are quite a bit more flawed than you'd probably see in the sort of normal protagonist. So to kind of see a book where no one in the book is really all that likable, but yet the story is still compelling, and I'm still interested in what happens. I think that's really well done. I didn't like Joe, but I didn't skip over his his parts, being like, oh, all right, it's Joe's talking. These pages, no, I think it was still like not liking Joe contributed to the enjoyment of the book.
Yes.
Because,
I do. I have that same fear when I'm going through the thinking about these sessions afterwards. I'm like, I realize that at times I think people might not understand that this is not really a criticism of how a character is written or created. This is me commenting on like how that well-written character lands with me as if I met them in the street, like and knew these things about them. Like the only one that is really just a commentary on the writing and the narrative at all was sort of Anna and Miss Doty, but everything else I've said about Kiki, Joe, Tane, and Charlotte has all been in the context of they're well done. And I mean, to go to like what counts at the end of the day, well, what counts is that the center of your story, whatever it centers on, works. And I think the center of this story is the Stedman family, and they are by far the most compelling 3 stories in the whole thing. I loved Charlotte's story, even though I hate Charlotte so much. I love Tane's story, even though I am just delighted that he got hit in the head and died. And then Sydney's story was really interesting. I find myself still sitting here thinking about Sydney because she's a bit enigmatic, and so much is told about her indirectly. So in that is what there is to enjoy about a book. Is not so much that you come to a book to meet a group of friends that you love to hang out with. You come to books for like different insights on different aspects of the world, and the book really succeeds on that. And for that reason, I would recommend people read it. I mean, if you're just watching this, go ahead and read it. It's worth your time. Yeah, I don't think like there's a regret in it, and I think it's one of those things. I also think when you try to do complex, not too flashy writing, it's a slow burn. The first time I read Sun Also Rises, I was like, what the hell is this? It's like a travel log. Why does everyone say it's so great? Sun Also Rises is a Hemingway book, by the way. It's his first book. He wrote it when he was like 26 or something. And it's basically On the Road before On the Road. It's him and loosely disguised versions of like this group of artists he hung around with in the 20s, I think it was. And him going to like bullfights in Spain and fishing and French hills and whatever else. But it was after I read the book, and then I like thoughts about it would come back to me, that made me like that book more. In the moment of reading the book, I was like, I'm not sure what this is, but there's like this little depth, and your brain knows it, and it hangs on to it. And so I feel like the fact that we could sit down for 5 weeks and talk about a book for 10, 11 hours speaks to it having depth, meaning, and complexity, for better or worse. There is substance here, and I think that in and of itself is a good accomplishment. And there's about 100 books that I couldn't do that with, so bravo, good job. Frances, I don't know if you ever watched this, but thank you for your book. Please talk to me again. Sorry for what I said about Anna. I'm sure it's very frustrating to hear.
No, but I think, and obviously, every writer is going to be different, but I think that, books are meant to be engaged with, right? And I think a good sort of review or a good critique or, good sort of conversation is going to talk about all the different components, and with the understanding that it's all subjective, right? And yes. What we think is going to be different from other people, and I think that's sort of part of the discourse around art, and like that's kind of the whole point, right? Is that it's meant to spur discussion and get people to think about things. So I think that we conducted these reviews in that vein, and that's certainly the perspective that I was coming from. I also I want to thank all of our watchers as well in chat for engaging with us on this, and also providing their perspective. I think there was some really insightful comments that were made, and details that were sort of fixed upon that I didn't necessarily notice either. So it's always nice to kind of have those multiple perspectives when we're talking about books. Plus, I'm just happy to be able to talk about books for
Most of this is usually done hours a week in the bathroom while I stare at the mirror to myself. So like, this is nice to pretend like it's a social activity. But yeah, I also want to point out, I don't know if you know this, because I don't think I've mentioned it to you, Avalon. 3/4 of our audience does not watch this live. These videos do amazingly well for a video stream that has a reading prerequisite on YouTube in 2022. I thought we would have 3 people, honest to God, because like, who reads anymore, right? Like, I didn't expect anyone to show up, and the fact that our videos have gotten like, I don't think less than 10 views in anything, but like 12 to 19, I think one of them's like 22 views. That's crazy. I don't know who you are, but thank you for watching. Hopefully it's not just like Frances in a rage watching these repeatedly. She
over and over again.
Where our houses, she thinks we live, and I'll show you
taking
to talk.
Note of every comment.
Clearly, just one day I just walk in the bathroom and like, there's a voice from the darkness about Anna. I thought the symbolism was pretty clear, so I'd like you to sit down while she's not like this at all. She's the nicest person in the world, which, by the way, is not terribly common. A lot of writers are kind of jerks, and Frances is not. We're jerks that get along with each other because we're the jerks in the same way. But I got to be honest, most of us aren't that friendly on the whole, and it's unique to find friendly writers. I also wanted to point out something I wanted to point out at the beginning is obviously Avalon and I are writers, so we approach this with a lot of interest in like how specific writing techniques are used and stuff. That's not the only way to do a book club, and it's not the only comments that matter. So if you feel like when you went through this, you were like, oh, I don't know anything about that, so I guess I can't say anything. That's not true at all. You can just comment on these characters as if they're real people that you've seen on like a Big Brother show, and steer the direct conversation that direction in any future series. It's a completely legitimate way to discuss a book. We're just nerds with way too much thoughts about prose and plot, and we spent a bunch of money on going to classes, and we've talked to people, and we've written thousands of words that we don't like any of them, but we keep writing them. Like, all of that informs a certain way that we approach a book, but it's not the only way. I was hoping a part of our unique appeal is like, what would it be if you were in a book club with writers, because writers are going to look at a book differently. I also want to point out that nobody, not any author, artist, anybody should expect that every part of their book works for everybody. I'm sure if we had a wide enough swath, someone would have been in our chat saying Anna was my favorite character. Like, oh yeah. And they're not wrong about that. Like, it's just who you are, what kind of baggage you bring to the art. That's just the way it goes. When you're an artist, you need to accept that people will arbitrarily dislike certain parts and love other parts. We are aware of it because we've had our work critiqued by a good variety of people who have said some very weird things. Won't name names, but they were all Felix. Felix has said some of the most helpful stuff that I've ever gotten writing, by the way, but he's also said some of the weirdest critiques I've ever heard, where I'm like, this is a book. Do you have any comments on it as a book?
I think that's the beauty of having all those different perspectives, is that, like, it's not very interesting to have every person like the same things, or, provide the same critique or the same perspective. You want to have an interesting discussion with all kinds of different points of view, and I would love to hear from someone why they enjoyed Anna's part of the novel, because I'm sure there'd be a really interesting kind of rationale behind that, and like that's sort of, I think, what makes a good conversation.
They might say something, and we might go, know what?
You're right.
Mm-hmm. I didn't see it that way, right?
Yeah, so I think, and one of the things too, I think about, for me, kind of, approaching this, like having, doing writing of my own, is I think you tend to be a more generous reader, because you kind of recognize just how much work it is to keep all of the plot threads, working in a way that makes reasonable sense. And it's rare now that I'll read a book and just be like, oh, like, this is absolute garbage. I mean, it still happens because there are just some terrible books out there, but I think I'm a lot more understanding and sort of willing to kind of give things a shot, because you can kind of recognize, oh, okay, like I can see what they're doing from this writerly perspective or this literary perspective. And so I think there's generally always something to enjoy or admire or get some be entertained by in most books, if you kind of sort of take a bit of a step back and kind of think about it that way. So I think that's also when you're in a book club as well, like you get to do that through multiple perspectives, which I think just can enhance the whole enjoyment of the story as well.
I would agree. I would say every time I've been asked to read something and I was in a discussion group of some sort, whether it was like a class and lit or whatever in university or just friends, I always got a lot more out of it, because everybody sort of absorbs different aspects to different depths, and so there's things that you miss when you're reading, like if you happen to be distracted in that moment or whatever, that other people pick up. And you mentioned, like, there are things in books I can't stand. Me too, and this book did none of them, which is a good sign. There are things that I'm just so unrepentantly judgmental about. Not to the benefit of anything, really, because, you know, it doesn't actually matter. It's just spend too much time thinking about reading and writing. Go outside and touch grass kind of thing. But yeah, this book was good. Was a good book. It had a lot of depth. I think that there's probably even pieces of it that we haven't pulled apart. You know, I was thinking, like, what is the overall commentary on class? But I just, I feel like there's a lot of layers to have pulled at. I just wanted to pull at the ones that interested our crowd the most. Okay, so that means we should probably talk about what our next book's going to be. The next book is somebody who's actually been on this channel before. Somebody who, I know Frances and talk to her like every 6 or 7 months. We'll sort of cross tweets and talk to each other and stuff like that. She's helped me with some stuff too, I should say. This person I know very well, and I talk to pretty much every week, if not multiple times a week, which is going to make it interesting to discuss in a book club setting. It leaves it to Avalon to be more straightforward. And that is Joseph. Joseph has a book that is coming out next week that I should have prepped a picture for. I will bring it up as a webpage, though. Give me a second here. It's called My Indian Summer. Now, unfortunately, because it's coming out next week, I can't as readily tell you like everything I'm going to do about it, including how long it is. But it's about 240 pages. I know that much. But I don't know everything I would need to know to give everybody every detail. Like, for example, what page are we reading up to? But copy image link. There we go. And there we go. All right, I'm gonna have to squish this down a bit and adjust it. Sorry for my complete lack of professionalism, but let's face it, that's why you're here. But you can sort of get a sense of the cover there. It's called My Indian Summer, Joseph Kakawina-Kanasam. And I have the name up there below me right now. The book launches September 29th, and our next episode would have been September 28th. So obviously can't be done. Which means that next week we will have no live stream, no Big Van Book Club live stream of it, because the book won't be available on the Wednesday. I don't know for sure, and I couldn't get a straight answer out of Joe about this, but I believe it's going to be an ebook. So you should be able to get it pretty readily, the way you did Broken Places. I'm sure most of us used ebooks. But I will say, since we are planning to read it together, pre-orders help a lot with authors, more so than almost anything else. Pre-orders really matter with books. And so if
it often determines how much publicity a book will get and how much support from the publisher.
Right. Exactly.
To do that. So I'll share the link where you can buy a copy through Tidewater Press.
Thank you very much. So I have pre-ordered a copy. I'm probably going to also buy a digital copy, to be honest. But by the way, there is a book launch on September 29th, which is a Thursday. So also next week, there will be no varietal show. I'm going to try and come up with something to sort of fill the space and maybe make people giggle a bit. But because it'll be 6 to 8 p.m. down at the Massey Art Gallery. If you live in Vancouver at 23 East Pender, Vancouver, you do have to sign up ahead of time. It is free. I think there's space left. But if you guys feel so inclined and want to see a book release and meet Joe yourself, you should come down. I will be there. Joe will be there, and a whole bunch of other people from Vancouver writing scene will be there. Avalon can't make it. If you're coming to, continue your stalking of Avalon, please go away. Yeah. So that's next Thursday, not this Thursday. But that's our next book is My Indian Summer by Joseph Kakawinokanasan, which is a story. Joe, if Frances Peck is a very intricate tapestry kind of writer, Joe is a very personal and to the point writer. He reminds me a lot of, in a favorable way, not as a person. He's a good person. And the person I'm going to name is not. But he reminds me a lot of Bukowski in his writing style. And I've told him that before. And Bukowski is sort of known for his biting, to the point prose and strong stories and clear imagery. And I think I have not read this particular book, by the way, but I have no doubt that style is going to carry over into Joe's book. I'm super excited about it. I've sort of followed pieces of what eventually became this book since 2018. Since I met Joe. Originally, I sat down when I met Joe properly, not just as a person in the class. He was sort of struggling over something in the waiting area of SFU after one of our classes, and I just went and talked to him as a stranger, and we talked about pieces of what would become this book. So I have a lot of connection to it, and I'm really looking forward to it. Go pre-order, because now there's a reason for it. So what that means is there will be no Big Van Book Club next week. There will be a Big Van Book Club for the following 2 weeks. And then we'll kind of go on hiatus until I find a book worth doing, really. Because, there's a few qualifications a book has to cross to be on the show. But we will, even after that, we will do more Big Van Book Club, because I know for a fact that a lot of books are coming out from people I know. And I promise you, I'm only cheerful about it and not even remotely petty and resentful.
Good to hear.
Yeah, that's right. Other people's success is good, I hear. That's a joke. I am very happy for Joe. If there's anybody who deserves a break in life, it's Joe.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think this book will really spur some interesting conversation for sure.
Absolutely. Joe is no holds barred, and he's got just his actual life stories. Like, just sitting with Joe and her asking him things about his life are hilarious and terrifying to listen to. Like, stories about being high on acid and trying to make deliveries around Vancouver and like biking into cop cars, and like Joe's had an interesting life. Well, this is a work of fiction, not a work of nonfiction. It is heavily inspired by his life in northern British Columbia as a Cree man, a Cree boy at that point. Half Cree, anyways. All right. So, I will give more details on that when I have it. So probably not this week, because I don't know anything about the book other than what I've told you so far. Next week, maybe on Friday, I'll put a pre-recorded video out that'll explain what pages we're doing, when we're doing them, and like for those who didn't stick around to the end of the stream, what the book is. But get your pre-orders out. Big Van Book Club is doing My Indian Summer by Joseph Kakawinokanasan. Other than that, thank you so much for your book, Frances Peck. Really enjoyed reading it. Can't believe we got as many hours of discussion out of it as we did I hope that means something, even if we were kind of jerks about Anna. What are your parting words overall for the series 1 of the Big Van Book Club?
Thanks everyone for coming out and listening to us and engaging with us. I think this was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to our next book.
Yeah, I am too. It's really cool that people have come out. If you think somebody would like this, or you think somebody would like My Indian Summer, let them know about the stream, man. Why are you keeping it to yourself? That's going to kill us. It's going to be your fault.
On that note.
You personally, audience who have chosen to tune in and support us. I'm putting an incredible amount of pressure on you. No, I'm kidding. I've actually been very happy with how this has gone. All right. Well, I look forward to disagreeing with you about characters in My Indian Summer.
Excellent. Looking forward to it.
And everybody else, keep on reading.